The land had always been quiet in a way that felt intentional, not empty. It sat at the edge of a carefully planned neighborhood, bordered by trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and streets named after trees that had been cut down long before the signs were installed. My property didn't fit the pattern. It existed before the neighborhood did, before committees, before laminated rulebooks and monthly meetings. The fence around it wasn't decorative, and the markers embedded into the soil weren't suggestions. They were boundaries placed there long ago, respected for decades, and ignored only when convenience started to outweigh truth. For years, nothing happened. The homeowners association grew louder, more organized, more confident, but it left my land alone. I wasn't part of their meetings. I didn't use their amenities. I paid no dues. I lived quietly, assuming that legal lines were enough to keep entitlement at bay. That assumption would prove fragile the moment plans were drawn without my name on them. First sign of trouble came in the form of activity rather than notice. One morning, I woke to the sound of machinery humming in the distance. It wasn't unusual to hear construction in a growing neighborhood, but this was different. The sound came from too close, from the direction of my eastern fence line. I dismissed it at first, assuming it was a nearby lot being cleared. It wasn't until I walked the perimeter that the unease settled into something heavier. A section of my fence had been removed. Not damaged by weather, not broken by accident, but cleanly dismantled. The posts were gone. The wire had been rolled and stacked neatly to the side, as if someone had decided it no longer belonged there. The ground where my boundary markers had once stood was disturbed, smoothed over, reshaped. Bright flags fluttered where nothing had been before, marking a future that hadn't been agreed upon. I stood there longer than necessary, trying to understand the logic behind what I was seeing. No notice had been delivered, no request made, no surveyor had knocked on my door. The land simply appeared to have been reassigned by assumption, as if years of ownership could be overwritten by a clipboard and a schedule. Over the next few days, the activity increased. Trucks came and went. Wooden frames were assembled. Bright plastic structures arrived wrapped in shrink film, their colors sharp and cheerful against the dirt. A sign was planted near the entrance, announcing a new community playground, complete with a scheduled grand opening date and a list of sponsors. The words were bold, confident, and entirely misplaced. The land was still mine. What unsettled me most wasn't the construction itself. It was the confidence behind it. This wasn't a mistake made by one careless contractor. It was a coordinated effort, planned and approved, executed with the full belief that no one would stop it. The fence had been removed because it was in the way. The markers had been moved because they contradicted the narrative. My absence from the process had been interpreted as consent. I began documenting everything. Photos, timestamps, vehicle plates, changes to the land. Each morning, the playground took more shape. Slides were bolted into place. Swings were hung. Benches were installed along what had once been my tree line. The soil was leveled and covered with soft ground material meant to cushion falls and erase footprints. The transformation was efficient, almost impressive, and entirely unauthorized. Neighbors started walking through the open space. Parents pushed strollers across ground they had never stepped on before. Children ran ahead, already claiming the structures as their own. The assumption had spread. This land was now public in their minds, repurposed without a second thought. No one asked why it had been fenced off for years. No one questioned the sudden change. The presence of official signage was enough. The homeowners association made no attempt to contact me. That silence spoke louder than any confrontation could have. They had decided that reaching out was unnecessary, that resistance would either not exist or would crumble under pressure. It was a familiar pattern, one I had seen play out in smaller ways across the neighborhood. Rules applied selectively. Authority expanded quietly. Those who questioned it were labeled difficult, uncooperative, or disruptive to community harmony. I wasn't interested in confrontation for its own sake. I was interested in clarity, so I went to the records office. The documents were exactly where they had always been. Deeds, surveys, plats, all confirming what I already knew. The land had never been transferred, leased, or rezoned. The boundaries were clear, the coordinates precise. What had changed was not ownership, but perception. Somewhere between planning sessions and budget approvals, my property had been absorbed into a collective fantasy of entitlement. With documents in hand, I contacted a licensed surveyor. Not one recommended by the association, not one familiar with their projects, but someone whose work was precise and unquestionable. The appointment was scheduled for the week before the grand opening. The timing wasn't accidental. By then, the playground would be complete, the excitement high, the assumption fully entrenched. Witnesses would be present. As the date approached, flyers began appearing in mailboxes. Social media posts circulated with cheerful captions and countdowns. Local vendors donated snacks. A ribbon was ordered. The association took credit publicly, praising its commitment to families and community growth. The narrative was complete, polished, and missing one critical detail: the land had an owner. On the morning of the grand opening, the neighborhood buzzed with activity. Balloons were tied to posts. A small table was set up near the entrance with brochures and branded water bottles. Volunteers moved about, adjusting decorations and testing equipment. Laughter carried across the field, blending with music played at a volume designed to feel festive without violating noise rules. I arrived quietly, standing just beyond the edge of the crowd. The surveyor arrived shortly after, equipment in tow, calm and methodical. He began his work without fanfare, placing markers where they belonged, aligning instruments with satellites and records older than the association itself. The contrast between celebration and calculation was stark. As the crowd gathered closer to the center of the playground, the surveyor's flags began to appear along the perimeter. Bright, unmistakable, and authoritative. They cut through the decorations like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence that had gone on too long. People noticed. Confusion rippled outward. Some assumed it was part of the event, an addition they hadn't been told about. Others sensed something was wrong. The association leaders stood near the front, smiling, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the shift. They had prepared speeches, not explanations. They had planned for applause, not accountability. The moment hung suspended, the celebration poised on the edge of interruption. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves, and the surveyor's work made them visible. The land told its story through measurements and lines, through markers that could not be argued with. The crowd watched as reality reasserted itself, quiet but undeniable. The grand opening had been planned as a moment of triumph. Instead, it became the beginning of something else entirely. As the music faded and the first questions began to surface, the air shifted. What had been a celebration was now a reckoning, unfolding in full view of the very community that had been invited to witness it. The playground stood complete, bright and unused, waiting for a verdict that could no longer be postponed. The next chapter would begin with consequences, not construction. The moment the surveyor's flags became impossible to ignore, the atmosphere shifted from celebration to confusion with a speed that surprised even me. Because moments earlier the space had been filled with the easy confidence of people who believed they were standing on unquestioned ground. And now that confidence cracked as parents slowed their steps. Children stopped running, and conversations fell into hushed, uncertain tones that spread across the field like a shadow moving against the sun. The playground stood finished and pristine, its bright colors clashing sharply with the thin neon lines marking property boundaries that had never moved but had been forgotten. And the contrast made something painfully clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding unfolding quietly in an office. It was a mistake being exposed in front of dozens of witnesses who had unknowingly been invited to celebrate it. I stayed where I was, not hidden but not centered either, watching as people tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been told. And the longer they stared at the flags, the more uncomfortable they became, because flags like those didn't belong to festivities. They belonged to disputes, courtrooms, and consequences. The association members near the front continued smiling for a few moments longer than they should have, their rehearsed enthusiasm lagging behind reality, until someone finally noticed the surveyor adjusting his equipment and speaking quietly into his recorder. And in that instant, the illusion shattered completely. The music faltered, not because it was turned off intentionally, but because no one remembered to keep it going, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any announcement could have been. Parents exchanged looks, some pulling their children closer, others scanning the perimeter as if expecting an explanation to materialize on its own, while volunteers who had been handing out refreshments froze mid-motion, unsure whether to continue or retreat. What struck me most was not outrage or anger, but disbelief, the kind that comes when people realize they have been confidently wrong, and that realization carried an edge sharper than embarrassment. The surveyor worked steadily, unaffected by the tension, placing markers where records dictated, not where convenience preferred, and each new flag was another quiet sentence added to a story that contradicted months of HOA planning. As word spread through the crowd, fragments of speculation began to circulate, some people assuming a paperwork error, others whispering about lawsuits, and a few starting to question aloud how a project of this size could have been approved without absolute certainty. And with each question, the authority the HOA had relied on began to erode. I watched board members huddle together, their body language stiff, their movements sharp and restrained, the confidence they'd worn earlier now replaced by hurried glances and forced composure, because they understood something the crowd was only beginning to grasp. This wasn't a small issue that could be smoothed over with apologies or promises. It was a public unraveling. The playground, once a symbol of community pride, now felt like an accusation standing in plain sight, built with enthusiasm but without permission, and its very presence intensified the scrutiny it attracted. People began pulling out their phones, not to take celebratory photos as intended, but to record, to document, to preserve a moment that no longer felt festive but historic in a quieter, more unsettling way. The surveyor finished his measurements and stepped back, reviewing his data with practiced calm, and though he said nothing publicly, his demeanor carried authority that needed no amplification, because facts don't require volume to be convincing. At that point, the association could no longer pretend this was a misunderstanding that might resolve itself later, because the evidence had been laid out physically on the ground, and it contradicted everything they had presented to the community. The crowd's mood turned inward, people reassessing their trust, questioning the leadership they had supported, and realizing that enthusiasm had replaced due diligence, and that realization lingered longer than any celebration would have. I remained silent, not because I lacked something to say, but because the moment didn't require it. The truth was doing the work on its own, and sometimes restraint carries more weight than confrontation. The flags fluttered gently in the breeze, unbothered by the tension they represented, while the playground sat untouched, its grand opening suspended indefinitely by lines that had always existed but had been inconvenient to acknowledge. Slowly, parents began to leave, some frustrated, some apologetic, others visibly angry at being put in a position they never asked for, and with each departure, the event lost momentum it would never regain. Volunteers packed up supplies without direction, folding tables and deflating balloons that now felt misplaced, while association members scrambled to control damage that had already escaped them. The land, quiet once more beneath the noise of disappointment and confusion, seemed to reclaim itself without effort, as if simply waiting for reality to catch up. By the time the crowd had thinned and the music equipment was powered down, the grand opening existed only as a memory of what happens when authority assumes ownership without verification. And the silence that followed was not peaceful but charged, heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. As the last car pulled away and the surveyor packed his equipment, the playground stood alone on land it did not belong to, exposed, documented, and impossible to ignore, setting the stage for consequences that would ripple far beyond a single failed celebration. And as I looked across the space that had been so confidently taken, I understood that the next chapter would not unfold quietly behind closed doors, but publicly, deliberately, and with repercussions the association had never prepared for. The days following the failed grand opening carried a strange, suspended energy, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, unsure whether to retreat into denial or brace for impact. And that uncertainty seeped into every interaction, every glance exchanged across driveways, every slowed step near the playground that now stood abandoned but impossible to ignore. The Homeowners Association moved quickly, not to acknowledge wrongdoing, but to regain control of the narrative, and their first response was silence wrapped in urgency. Emails marked important but empty of answers, notices promising updates without substance, and closed-door meetings held behind drawn blinds where voices rose and fell in rhythms that suggested panic rather than planning. The playground, once the centerpiece of cheerful anticipation, became a daily reminder of overreach, its bright structures visible from multiple streets, a constant symbol of something built too fast and justified too poorly. Parents avoided it instinctively, tugging their children away with vague explanations, because even without full understanding, people recognize instability when they see it, and instability had settled over the space like dust after demolition. I continued documenting everything, not out of obsession, but because experience had taught me that the quiet periods between confrontations were often where the most important shifts occurred. And during those quiet days, subtle changes began to surface. Survey flags disappeared overnight, removed with a clumsiness that suggested desperation rather than authority, only to be replaced again by the surveyor at my request, each reappearance reinforcing the futility of trying to erase facts by moving markers. The association's communications grew increasingly defensive, shifting from celebratory language to legal phrasing, a transition that did not go unnoticed by residents who had never before seen their board speak in anything other than cheerful certainty. Rumors circulated freely, filling the gaps left by official silence, and those rumors carried weight because they were fueled by first-hand witness rather than speculation. People sharing what they had seen, how abruptly the event had ended, how quickly confidence had dissolved, and how unsettling it felt to realize that something so visible could have been so wrong. The association attempted to frame the situation as a technical delay, a minor boundary clarification that would soon be resolved. But their messaging faltered because the playground remained untouched, fenced off not by wire but by doubt, and doubt spreads faster than any formal announcement. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted, and it became clear that the board was divided, some members pushing for aggressive defense, others urging quiet negotiation, all of them aware that the community's trust was slipping through their fingers. Legal counsel was consulted, not once but repeatedly, and each consultation seemed to produce more tension than reassurance, because laws do not bend to enthusiasm or intent, and the documents were unambiguous. The land was mine, the construction unauthorized, and the exposure public, a combination that left little room for maneuvering. As the association scrambled, their efforts began to spill into the open in ways they couldn't fully control. Letters delivered with carefully chosen language that hinted at compromise without admitting fault. Requests framed as collaboration that felt suspiciously like retreat. And suggestions of shared use that ignored the fundamental issue of consent. I responded methodically, not emotionally, because this was not a conflict that would be resolved through volume or outrage, but through consistency and clarity favored those who could afford to wait. Neighbors began approaching me quietly, some apologetic, others curious, a few visibly frustrated with the association for placing them in an awkward position, and those conversations revealed how deeply the board's confidence had shaped perception, convincing people that permission had been secured simply because authority had claimed it. The realization that this confidence had been misplaced unsettled many, because it forced a reevaluation not just of the playground, but of other decisions that had been accepted without question. And that reevaluation was perhaps the most dangerous outcome for the association, because trust, once questioned, rarely returns to its original form. Meanwhile, the playground itself began to change, not physically, but symbolically, transforming from a gift into a liability, its bright colors now drawing attention to the mistake rather than masking it. And with each passing day, its presence intensified the pressure to resolve the situation decisively. Maintenance crews stopped visiting, insurance coverage was quietly reviewed, and liability discussions crept into conversations that had once been about ribbon colors and opening speeches, because the reality of risk had replaced the fantasy of celebration. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer, pointing at swings they couldn't use, asking why something built for them was suddenly forbidden, and those questions echoed larger ones the community was beginning to ask itself about accountability and oversight. The association attempted to regain footing by asserting procedural authority, referencing bylaws and community interests. But those arguments rang hollow when measured against property records and legal boundaries that predated the neighborhood itself. And the mismatch between rhetoric and reality grew more pronounced with each attempt to deflect responsibility. I sensed the shift not through announcements, but through tone, the way messages softened, the way timelines became vague, the way demands transformed into requests, and that shift confirmed what I had suspected from the beginning. The confidence that fueled the construction had been borrowed, not earned, and now that it was being called in, the association had little left to offer. The surveyor's report was finalized and distributed, its precision leaving no room for interpretation, and once it entered the association's internal discussions, the dynamic changed completely, because speculation thrives in uncertainty, but documentation ends it. The board members were forced to confront the consequences not as abstract risks, but as concrete outcomes with names, dates, and figures attached, and that confrontation fractured whatever unity they had maintained. Some members distanced themselves publicly, others doubled down privately, but none could undo what had already happened, and the longer the playground stood unused, the more it testified against them. The neighborhood, once eager for a shared amenity, began to feel manipulated, realizing that their enthusiasm had been leveraged without proper diligence, and that realization bred resentment not toward me, but toward the leadership that had assumed ownership it did not have. By the end of the week, the association's silence had become louder than any statement, and the playground, still standing on land it did not belong to, had become the focal point of a conflict that extended far beyond swings and slides, touching on issues of authority, entitlement, and the fragile line between governance and overreach. As I looked across the field one evening, watching the light fade over structures that had never been meant to stand there, it was clear that the association was running out of time, because the longer they delayed a decisive response, the more the narrative solidified against them. And with every unanswered question and every avoided acknowledgement, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would no longer be about compromise, but about accountability. A confrontation that would define the next chapter, whether they were ready for it or not. By the time the association finally broke its silence, the neighborhood had already formed its own conclusions, and those conclusions were far less forgiving than anything a carefully worded statement could undo, because people tend to trust what they witness over what they are told, and what they had witnessed was confidence collapsing under scrutiny. The message arrived as a formal notice, drafted in the kind of language that tries to sound calm while betraying urgency, acknowledging a boundary discrepancy, and promising a cooperative resolution, but never once admitting fault, never once addressing how a project of that scale had moved forward without consent, and that omission spoke louder than any apology could have. The notice was followed by a flurry of smaller communications, clarifications layered on top of corrections, each one attempting to narrow the issue, to make it seem procedural rather than fundamental. But the effort only highlighted how unprepared the association was for resistance grounded in documentation rather than emotion. Behind the scenes, the pressure intensified, and it showed in subtle but telling ways. The sudden appearance of temporary fencing around the playground not to secure it, but to signal control. The hurried installation of warning signs that attempted to shift responsibility onto hypothetical trespassers, and the abrupt cancellation of other community events that had nothing to do with the dispute, but were casualties of a board stretched too thin to manage appearances. Neighbors noticed everything, because once attention sharpens, nothing escapes it, and the same people who had once accepted board decisions without question began dissecting every move, every delay, every carefully chosen word. Conversations that had once revolved around landscaping preferences and parking complaints shifted toward governance, authority, and accountability, and those conversations carried a weight that unsettled the association far more than any legal threat could have, because they signaled a loss of trust that no policy amendment could easily restore. Requests for meetings increased, attendance surged, and what had once been sparsely attended gatherings became crowded affairs charged with tension, even before anyone spoke, because people arrived not to listen, but to understand how something so basic had been overlooked. The board responded by tightening access, limiting discussion, and invoking procedure, strategies that only reinforced the perception that transparency was being sacrificed in favor of damage control. Meanwhile, the playground continued to loom over everything, its presence impossible to ignore, a physical reminder of what happens when authority assumes ownership without verification. And each day it remained standing amplified the sense that the association was trapped by its own decisions. Insurance providers began asking questions, not aggressively, but persistently, and those questions carried implications that extended beyond the playground itself, touching on liability, oversight, and precedent, because if one unauthorized project could proceed unchecked, what else might be vulnerable? Contractors distanced themselves quietly. Invoices were reviewed with new caution, and sponsorship logos that had once been proudly displayed began to disappear from promotional materials, as partners sought to avoid association with a controversy that was gaining momentum rather than resolution. I observed these shifts from a distance, not out of detachment, but because proximity was no longer necessary. The situation was unfolding visibly and predictably, driven by forces larger than any individual confrontation. The association attempted outreach, framing it as collaboration, but the timing betrayed its intent, because collaboration offered only after exposure rarely feels genuine, and the proposals that followed reflected that imbalance, suggestions of shared use, partial easements, or retroactive agreements that assumed flexibility where none existed. Each proposal ignored the fundamental issue of consent, treating ownership as a negotiable inconvenience rather than a fixed reality. and that disconnect underscored the mindset that had allowed the project to proceed in the first place. Neighbors who had initially been neutral began voicing frustration openly, not at the dispute itself, but at the way it was being handled, questioning why transparency had been sacrificed, why records hadn't been verified, and why the board seemed more concerned with preserving authority than acknowledging error. Those questions lingered, unanswered, because there were no satisfying responses that did not involve admitting a failure of oversight, and that admission carried implications the association was reluctant to face. As weeks passed, the situation hardened, positions becoming less flexible rather than more, not because compromise was impossible, but because trust had eroded to the point where intentions were scrutinized as closely as actions, and every move was interpreted through a lens of skepticism. The playground, still unused, began to deteriorate subtly, not structurally, but symbolically, its bright colors fading under constant sun, its surfaces collecting dust rather than footprints, and that slow decay mirrored the association standing in the eyes of the community, visible, undeniable, and entirely self-inflicted. Parents explained the situation to their children in simplified terms, framing it as a lesson about rules and respect. And those explanations, though gentle, carried a quiet indictment of leadership that had failed to model either. The association's internal divisions became more apparent as board members resigned quietly or stepped back from public roles, their departures unannounced but noticed, because absence speaks volumes in organizations built on visibility. New faces attempted to steady the ship, but they inherited a situation already defined by exposure, and their efforts were constrained by decisions they had not made but were now responsible for defending. Legal counsel grew more involved, not as a threat, but as a necessity, and the tone of communications shifted accordingly, becoming more guarded, more deliberate, and less hopeful, because the window for informal resolution had narrowed significantly. Throughout it all, the land itself remained unchanged beneath the layers of conflict, its boundaries constant, its history indifferent to the temporary structures imposed upon it, and that constancy served as a quiet counterpoint to the turmoil surrounding it. I understood then that the association's greatest miscalculation had not been building the playground, but assuming that authority could replace verification, that enthusiasm could substitute for consent, and that silence would discourage resistance, because the exposure had not only halted a project, it had forced a community to confront uncomfortable truths about governance and accountability. As the fourth week drew to a close, it became clear that the next phase would not be defined by proposals or public relations, but by decisions that could no longer be postponed, decisions that would determine whether the association could recover any measure of credibility or whether the playground would become a permanent monument to overreach. And as the pressure mounted and patience thinned, the path forward narrowed, setting the stage for a turning point that would leave little room for retreat in the chapter, yet to unfold. The turning point arrived not with an announcement, but with a shift in posture, subtle at first yet unmistakable once it became clear that the association had moved from denial into containment. A phase marked by calculated restraint rather than confidence, and that shift revealed how deeply the situation had unsettled those who once believed control was automatic. Notices stopped entirely, not because the issue had resolved, but because every word now carried potential consequences, and silence, though dangerous, felt safer than misstatement. In its place came quiet activity, closed sessions, legal consultations that stretched late into the evening, and a reorganization of responsibilities that suggested preparation for outcomes rather than optimism for reversal. The playground, still standing on land it did not belong to, began to feel less like an asset and more like evidence. Its presence now a liability that could not be ignored but also could not be easily removed without acknowledging fault. And that limbo created tension that rippled through every decision the board made. Neighbors sensed the change, because communities attuned to authority can feel when it falters, and the once decisive board now appeared hesitant, reactive, and fragmented, a contrast that did not go unnoticed by residents who had begun paying closer attention to governance than ever before. Meetings grew more procedural, less celebratory, with agendas tightly controlled and discussions carefully limited. Yet the questions kept coming, persistent and increasingly pointed, because once people begin to question authority, they rarely return to passive acceptance. The association attempted to redirect focus toward other initiatives, smaller projects designed to project normalcy, but each attempt felt forced, overshadowed by the unresolved presence of the playground and the implications it carried. The land, unchanged beneath the temporary structures, continued to assert itself through documentation rather than confrontation, and that quiet consistency proved more powerful than any argument, because facts do not need reinforcement when they are uncontested. As pressure mounted, the association's legal counsel began to shape the conversation more visibly, advising caution, urging restraint, and emphasizing risk management over public relations. And those priorities reshaped the board's approach, shifting it from outward assertion to inward calculation. The language of communications became increasingly technical, stripped of warmth and community rhetoric, reflecting a mindset that no longer sought approval but survival. Residents noticed the change in tone immediately, interpreting it as confirmation that something serious had gone wrong, and that interpretation spread quickly, fueled by the absence of clear explanations and the growing awareness that the board's authority was not as absolute as once believed. Behind the scenes, discussions turned toward removal, not as a solution, but as a necessity. Yet even that path was fraught with complications, because dismantling the playground would mean acknowledging the mistake publicly, absorbing the costs privately, and facing questions about accountability that could not be answered with vague assurances. The board found itself trapped between two unpalatable options: leave the playground standing as a monument to overreach, or remove it and confirm the very failure they had tried to minimize, and that dilemma paralyzed decision-making in a way no amount of procedure could resolve. Contractors, sensing uncertainty, demanded clarity before committing to any further action, and sponsors distanced themselves completely, unwilling to be associated with a dispute that now carried legal and reputational risk, and their withdrawal further isolated the association, stripping it of external support at a moment when it needed it most. The neighborhood's conversations evolved accordingly, shifting from speculation about outcomes to analysis of responsibility, with residents discussing not just what should happen to the playground, but how such a situation had been allowed to occur, and those discussions often circled back to the same uncomfortable conclusion: unchecked authority invites error. I observed these developments with measured patience, aware that the most consequential shifts often occur quietly, long before any public resolution, and that patience was not passivity but strategy, because allowing the association's internal pressures to surface naturally would reveal more than any direct confrontation could. The surveyor's report remained the anchor point, referenced repeatedly in discussions and documents, its precision leaving no room for reinterpretation. And as it circulated, it became a kind of silent witness, present in every deliberation, shaping outcomes without needing to speak. The association's attempts at informal outreach slowed, replaced by formal channels that emphasized caution over cooperation, and that transition marked a critical moment, because it signaled recognition of the seriousness of the situation, even if acknowledgement remained implicit rather than explicit. Neighbors who had initially remained distant began expressing frustration more openly, questioning why transparency had been delayed, why the board seemed unwilling to address the issue directly, and why responsibility appeared so diffused. And those questions carried weight because they came not from opposition, but from within the community the association claimed to represent. Trust, once eroded, does not collapse all at once, but rather fractures incrementally. And by this point, the fractures were visible, spreading outward from the playground into broader concerns about governance, accountability, and oversight. The association attempted to reassure residents through controlled messaging, emphasizing commitment to resolution and community values. But the absence of concrete action undermined those assurances, because words without follow-through invite skepticism rather than confidence. The playground itself continued to deteriorate symbolically, its unused equipment collecting dust and leaves, its surfaces fading slightly under constant exposure, and that quiet decay mirrored the board's standing in the community, visible yet unaddressed. Children stopped asking about it, accepting its absence as normal, while adults grew increasingly impatient, viewing it as a reminder of resources misallocated and trust misplaced. The land, steady beneath it all, seemed almost indifferent to the turmoil, its boundaries unchanged, its history unbothered by temporary structures and shifting authority, and that indifference underscored a truth the association was struggling to accept. Ownership does not bend to intention. As the fifth week drew to a close, it became evident that the association's strategy of delay was unsustainable, because delay had not reduced tension, but amplified it, turning a single project into a catalyst for broader scrutiny. And that scrutiny was now focused not just on the playground, but on the legitimacy of decision-making processes that had allowed it to be built in the first place. The stage was set for action, not because anyone demanded it loudly, but because inaction had become more damaging than any admission of error could be. And as the pressure converged from legal, financial, and community fronts, the association stood at a crossroads, forced to choose between preserving a fragile image and confronting a reality that would redefine its authority in the chapter that lay ahead. The decision, when it finally came, arrived quietly, almost timidly, as if the association hoped that by avoiding spectacle it could minimize the weight of its own acknowledgement. Yet even in its subtlety, the shift was unmistakable to anyone paying attention, because restraint itself had become a signal that the board no longer believed in its ability to dominate the narrative. Without fanfare or announcement, activity resumed around the playground, not with the energy of construction but with the careful precision of dismantling. And that reversal carried a symbolism far heavier than the original build, because undoing something publicly celebrated requires an admission no statement can fully soften. Early one morning, trucks arrived not to add, but to remove, their movements deliberate, their presence unmistakable, and the sight of workers methodically unbolting structures drew residents from their homes, curiosity and recognition pulling them toward the edges of the land they had once assumed was communal. The association framed the action as maintenance, a temporary measure pending resolution, but few accepted that explanation, because maintenance does not involve complete disassembly, and the absence of transparency only deepened skepticism. The playground came apart piece by piece, slides lowered carefully to the ground, swings detached and stacked, benches unanchored, and with each removal, the illusion of permanence dissolved, revealing how fragile authority becomes when it is built on assumption rather than verification. Neighbors watched in silence, some with relief, others with quiet vindication, because the act of removal confirmed what documentation had already established, that the land had never been theirs to claim, and that realization settled heavily over the community, reshaping perceptions not just of the project, but of the board that had championed it. The association did not issue apologies, but the absence of celebration spoke volumes, because dismantling something without explanation invites interpretation, and interpretation in this case leaned heavily toward accountability. As equipment disappeared, the land beneath re-emerged, scarred but recognizable, its contours reminding everyone that it had existed long before swings and slides, long before banners and promises, and that longevity carried authority no committee could replicate. The process stretched over several days, each one reinforcing the message that the association was retreating, not negotiating, and that retreat, though necessary, came too late to preserve the confidence it once enjoyed. Residents discussed the unfolding scene in hushed tones, sharing observations, speculating about internal debates, and revisiting earlier decisions with newfound skepticism, because once trust is shaken, history is re-examined through a different lens. The board attempted to limit access to information, but the dismantling itself served as a public record, visible proof that words had failed where actions now spoke, and those actions resonated far beyond the playground. Legal implications loomed quietly in the background, not as threats, but as realities shaping every step, because removal did not erase liability, and the board understood that undoing a mistake does not automatically absolve responsibility for having made it. Contractors worked efficiently, but their caution was evident. Procedures followed meticulously, documentation gathered thoroughly, as if everyone involved understood the significance of the moment and the scrutiny it attracted. The association's communications remained sparse, limited to logistical updates that avoided context, and that avoidance only amplified speculation, because people fill silence with their own conclusions, and in this case, those conclusions were informed by weeks of observation rather than rumor. Neighbors who had once supported the project openly expressed frustration at the lack of accountability, questioning why acknowledgement had been avoided, why transparency had been delayed, and why responsibility seemed to dissolve into process rather than settle on decision makers. And those questions lingered unanswered, eroding confidence further. I watched the dismantling with a sense of inevitability rather than triumph, because the outcome had never been in doubt once the facts were established. And what unfolded now was less about victory than about correction, a necessary reassertion of boundaries that should never have been crossed. The surveyor returned briefly to confirm markers, his presence a reminder that resolution requires verification, not assumption, and his work, though quiet, reaffirmed the authority of documentation over enthusiasm. As the last structures were removed and loaded onto trucks, the land began to resemble its former self, though traces of disruption remained: compacted soil, disturbed vegetation, and the lingering impression of something imposed and withdrawn. And those traces served as reminders that even temporary overreach leaves lasting marks. The association erected temporary barriers, not to claim ownership, but to acknowledge absence, an ironic reversal that did not go unnoticed, and those barriers felt less like control and more like concession. The neighborhood's response evolved accordingly, shifting from anticipation to reflection, with residents discussing not what had been lost, but what had been revealed, namely the risks of unchecked authority and the importance of vigilance, lessons learned at the cost of trust and resources. The board's internal dynamics shifted further, resignations occurring quietly, responsibilities redistributed, and new committees formed under the guise of reform. Yet these changes felt reactive rather than transformative, because reform announced under pressure rarely inspires confidence. The land, now free of structures, stood as it had before, but the context around it had changed irreversibly, because the dispute had forced a community to confront the limits of governance and the necessity of consent. As the trucks departed and the site fell silent once more, the absence of celebration was its own statement, a quiet acknowledgement that the association's authority had been challenged and curtailed not through confrontation, but through consistency and documentation. The chapter closed not with resolution, but with a pause, a collective moment of reassessment, because while the physical issue had been addressed, the underlying questions about accountability, trust, and governance remained unresolved, and those questions would shape the next phase of the story, ensuring that what followed would not be about land alone, but about the redefinition of authority itself. With the playground gone and the land stripped back to its original contours, the neighborhood entered a phase that felt quieter on the surface but far more volatile underneath. Because removal did not bring closure, it exposed a vacuum where authority once stood unquestioned, and that vacuum demanded to be filled with explanations the association had yet to provide. The absence of swings and slides did not erase memory. Instead, it sharpened it, leaving residents with an empty field that now carried more meaning than the brightly colored structures ever had. A reminder not of what was lost, but of what had been assumed. Conversations shifted again, this time from speculation about outcomes to demands for accountability. Because once a mistake is acknowledged through action, even silently, people expect responsibility to follow, and the board's continued reluctance to address the issue directly became increasingly difficult to justify. Attendance at meetings surged further, no longer driven by curiosity but by expectation, and the atmosphere in those rooms felt different, heavier, less tolerant of deflection, as residents arrived armed with questions that had matured over weeks of observation and frustration. The association attempted to regain footing by emphasizing procedural review, announcing committees, audits, and future safeguards, but these gestures felt retrospective rather than restorative, and many residents recognized them as attempts to manage fallout rather than confront cause. Trust, once fractured, had begun to calcify into skepticism, and skepticism does not soften easily, especially when it is reinforced by visible evidence of overreach. The board's internal strain became increasingly apparent as discussions grew more contentious, not just between residents and leadership, but among board members themselves, whose differing views on responsibility and reform surfaced in subtle disagreements and delayed decisions. Some members advocated for transparency, pushing for a full accounting of how the project had been approved and who had signed off, while others urged caution, fearing that openness would invite legal consequences and further erode authority. And this division paralyzed progress, because accountability requires unity of purpose, not just intent. Neighbors sensed the hesitation and pressed harder, filing formal requests for records, budgets, and correspondence, exercising rights they had rarely felt compelled to use before. And those requests marked a turning point, because they signaled a shift from passive reliance on governance to active oversight. The association responded slowly, carefully, releasing information in fragments that raised more questions than they answered. And each partial disclosure reinforced the perception that something was being withheld, whether intentionally or through disorganization, both of which undermined confidence. The land itself, now quiet once more, became a gathering point for reflection rather than activity. Residents walking its edges, noticing the survey markers, discussing boundaries and history, and in doing so, reclaiming a sense of awareness that had been dulled by years of assumption. Parents used the situation as a teaching moment, explaining to their children why the playground was gone, framing it as a lesson about rules and respect. And those explanations, though simplified, carried an implicit critique of leadership that resonated beyond childhood understanding. The association attempted to reframe the narrative by highlighting past successes and community contributions, but those efforts felt disconnected from the present concern, because when trust is questioned, history becomes less persuasive than accountability. Legal considerations loomed ever-present, shaping every decision and statement, yet the board's caution increasingly resembled avoidance, and avoidance in the face of sustained scrutiny often amplifies rather than mitigates risk. Residents began organizing independently, forming informal groups to discuss governance, bylaws, and oversight, not as an act of rebellion, but as a response to perceived failure, and these groups fostered a level of engagement the association had not anticipated, nor could easily control. The tone of the neighborhood shifted subtly but definitively, moving away from complacency toward vigilance, as people who had once trusted decisions implicitly now demanded justification explicitly. I observed this transformation with a sense of inevitability, understanding that the dispute had become less about my land and more about collective awakening, a realization that authority must be questioned to remain legitimate. The association's leadership struggled to adapt to this new reality, accustomed to deference and routine, now facing an audience unwilling to accept explanations without evidence. And that struggle manifested in delayed responses, revised agendas, and a growing reliance on legal counsel to mediate interactions that once required little more than procedural reference. The absence of the playground did not restore normalcy. Instead, it marked the beginning of a recalibration that would take time and intention to complete, because communities do not easily forget moments when trust was misplaced. As weeks passed, pressure mounted for a comprehensive explanation, not just of what had happened, but of how similar errors would be prevented, and the board's inability to provide a satisfying answer further eroded confidence. The land stood unchanged, its boundaries reaffirmed, yet its significance had expanded, symbolizing the limits of governance and the importance of consent, and that symbolism resonated far beyond the immediate dispute. Residents who had once remained neutral began aligning with calls for reform, recognizing that silence had enabled overreach, and that engagement was necessary to prevent recurrence. The association's attempts to move forward without addressing the past met resistance at every turn, because unresolved questions have a way of resurfacing, particularly when they touch on fundamental issues of authority and accountability. As Chapter 7 drew to a close, it was clear that the conflict had evolved into something larger than any single project or parcel of land, becoming a catalyst for change that would redefine the relationship between the association and the community it served. And that redefinition, still unfolding, promised consequences that would extend far beyond the boundaries originally crossed, setting the stage for a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. By the time the association realized that procedural gestures alone would not satisfy a community that had learned the cost of assumption, the tone of the neighborhood had already shifted from vigilance to insistence, and that insistence carried a clarity that could no longer be redirected or softened with promises of future reform. The empty field where the playground had stood became a symbol not just of overreach corrected, but of accountability deferred, and residents increasingly framed their concerns around the absence of answers rather than the presence of mistakes, because mistakes, once acknowledged, can be forgiven, but evasion erodes trust far more deeply. Pressure mounted through formal channels as well as informal ones, requests for records multiplied, attendance at meetings remained high, and the expectation of transparency hardened into a demand that could not be ignored without consequence. The association attempted to assert control through structure, tightening agendas and limiting discussion time. But these measures backfired because they reinforced the perception that leadership was more interested in managing optics than engaging with substance. Residents pushed back, invoking bylaws, procedural rights, and governance principles that had rarely been exercised so forcefully before. And in doing so, they transformed the dynamic of meetings from passive presentations into active interrogations, where questions were not rhetorical but precise, and answers were expected to be equally so. The board, unaccustomed to this level of scrutiny, struggled to respond coherently, its members divided between those who favored transparency and those who feared its implications. And this division manifested in delayed decisions and inconsistent messaging that only fueled further skepticism. Legal counsel continued to shape the board's responses, advising caution and restraint. Yet this caution increasingly resembled paralysis, because the community's patience had worn thin, and each deferral intensified the sense that accountability was being intentionally postponed. The land itself remained unchanged, its boundaries clear, its quiet presence underscoring the contrast between physical resolution and administrative stagnation, and residents began to see in that contrast a reflection of the board's broader approach, decisive when convenient, hesitant when challenged. Conversations extended beyond the immediate dispute, touching on past decisions that had been accepted without question, and this retrospective scrutiny revealed patterns that many found troubling, reinforcing the belief that the playground was not an isolated incident but a symptom of deeper issues. As discussions grew more pointed, some board members began to distance themselves publicly, issuing carefully worded statements that emphasized personal commitment to improvement while avoiding responsibility for past actions. And these attempts at individual absolution further fragmented the board's credibility. Residents responded by organizing more formally, establishing committees and communication channels independent of the association, not to undermine it, but to ensure that oversight did not rely solely on the goodwill of those in power. And this parallel structure represented a significant shift in the community's approach to governance. The association's leadership recognized the challenge but struggled to adapt, because authority accustomed to deference rarely adjusts smoothly to accountability, and the tension between these modes of governance became increasingly apparent in every interaction. The absence of the playground did not diminish its impact. Instead, it amplified the lessons it had imparted, reminding residents daily of the importance of verification, consent, and transparency, and these lessons informed their expectations moving forward. As the 8th chapter of the dispute unfolded, it became evident that resolution would require more than removal or reform. It would demand a reckoning with the assumptions that had allowed overreach to occur unchecked. And that reckoning, though still incomplete, was now unavoidable, setting the stage for decisive actions that would define the community's future and determine whether trust could be rebuilt, or whether the fractures exposed would become permanent. The reckoning, when it finally began, did not arrive as a dramatic confrontation, but as a steady convergence of pressure, expectation, and inevitability, because by this point the community no longer needed outrage to fuel action, only clarity and follow-through. The association, faced with sustained scrutiny and a visibly mobilized membership, acknowledged that incremental gestures would no longer suffice, and this realization marked a subtle but decisive shift in approach, one that prioritized resolution over preservation of image. A comprehensive review was announced, not as a vague promise, but as a structured process with defined scope, timelines, and external oversight. And while skepticism remained, the specificity of the plan signaled a recognition that credibility could only be restored through transparency rather than control. Residents responded cautiously, aware that announcements alone do not guarantee accountability. Yet the commitment to an independent review represented a departure from previous deflections, suggesting that the board had finally accepted the need for external validation. The process began methodically, examining not only the playground project but the decision-making framework that had enabled it. And as findings emerged, patterns became apparent, revealing gaps in oversight, reliance on assumption, and a culture that prioritized efficiency over verification. These revelations, though unsettling, provided the clarity residents had been seeking, transforming frustration into a more constructive focus on reform, because understanding the cause of failure is a prerequisite for preventing its recurrence. The association's leadership confronted these findings with varying degrees of acceptance, some members embracing the opportunity for reform, others struggling with the implications for their tenure, and this divergence reshaped the board's internal dynamics, prompting resignations and reassignments that signaled a willingness to change, even if reluctantly. Communication improved incrementally, with regular updates replacing silence, and while trust was not instantly restored, the shift toward openness tempered the community's skepticism, because consistency over time carries its own authority. The land remained a quiet constant throughout this process, its boundaries reaffirmed, its presence a reminder of the dispute that had catalyzed change, and residents began to view it less as a point of contention and more as a reference, a tangible example of why diligence matters. Discussions expanded to include broader governance reforms, with residents contributing ideas and expectations informed by their recent experience, and this engagement marked a significant evolution in the community's relationship with the association, moving from passive reliance to active partnership. The board, recognizing this shift, adapted its approach, inviting participation and acknowledging past missteps more directly, and though these admissions were measured, they represented a meaningful departure from earlier avoidance. The process was not without tension, as accountability rarely unfolds without discomfort, yet the community's commitment to resolution rather than retribution created space for progress, allowing reforms to take shape without being overshadowed by lingering resentment. As the review progressed, the association implemented interim safeguards, verifying boundaries for future projects, establishing clearer approval protocols, and incorporating external expertise where necessary. And these changes, though procedural, addressed the root causes identified, reinforcing the lesson that authority must be grounded in verification. Residents observed these developments with cautious optimism, recognizing that trust, once eroded, rebuilds slowly, yet acknowledging that sustained effort can yield progress. The narrative surrounding the playground evolved accordingly, no longer framed solely as a mistake, but as a catalyst that exposed vulnerabilities and prompted reform, and this reframing helped the community contextualize the dispute within a broader journey toward accountability. By the end of the 9th chapter, the association stood at a crossroads not of crisis, but of opportunity, having confronted its shortcomings and begun the work of redefining its relationship with the community. And while the path forward remained uncertain, the willingness to engage openly suggested that the lessons learned would not be easily forgotten, setting the stage for a conclusion shaped by reflection rather than conflict. The conclusion did not arrive with celebration or triumph, but with a quiet recalibration of power and expectation that settled over the neighborhood like a long-awaited exhale. Because by the time the final changes were implemented, everyone understood that what had unfolded was never really about a playground, but about the boundaries that define ownership, authority, and trust. The association, reshaped by review and reform, moved forward with a noticeably different posture, one grounded less in assumption and more in verification. And this shift, though subtle, was evident in every decision that followed, from the way projects were proposed to the manner in which community input was solicited and documented. Residents, having witnessed the consequences of unchecked authority, engaged more actively, not with hostility but with awareness, understanding that vigilance is not opposition, but a necessary component of healthy governance. The land itself returned to its quiet state, no longer a battleground but a reference point, its boundaries respected, its history acknowledged, and its presence a reminder of the moment when assumption gave way to accountability. The association addressed the dispute openly at last, acknowledging missteps without defensiveness, outlining reforms without exaggeration, and committing to transparency not as a slogan but as a practice. And while these acknowledgments did not erase the past, they provided a foundation for moving forward without denial. Trust, though not fully restored, began to rebuild incrementally, reinforced by consistency rather than rhetoric, as residents observed decisions being made with greater care and documentation. And this gradual shift fostered a cautious optimism that replaced the earlier tension. The narrative surrounding the playground evolved into a shared story of learning rather than conflict, discussed not as a grievance, but as a turning point that had strengthened the community's understanding of its own governance. Children who had once asked why the playground disappeared now accepted the explanation as part of the neighborhood's history, and in that acceptance lay a quiet lesson about respect for boundaries and the importance of asking permission before acting. The association's reforms extended beyond procedure, influencing culture as well, encouraging dialogue, accountability, and humility in leadership, qualities that had been absent during the project's inception. As time passed, the empty field ceased to draw attention, blending back into the landscape, yet its significance endured, etched into collective memory as a reminder that authority is not inherent but earned, and that ownership, once challenged, must be defended with clarity rather than confrontation. The experience reshaped relationships within the neighborhood, fostering a more balanced dynamic between governance and community, where oversight was welcomed rather than resisted, and where decisions were scrutinized not out of mistrust, but out of a shared commitment to fairness. Looking back, it became clear that the true resolution lay not in the removal of structures or the implementation of reforms, but in the shift of mindset that followed, a recognition that enthusiasm must be tempered by diligence, and that community thrives not on assumption, but on respect. As the story reached its end, the lesson remained simple yet profound, that boundaries matter, documentation protects, and accountability, though uncomfortable, strengthens rather than weakens the communities willing to embrace it, leaving behind not a monument to conflict, but a foundation for trust rebuilt through experience.